On a crisp October afternoon in 1999, the town of Cedar Creek, Utah, was suspended in the amber light of autumn. It was a place defined by the vast, open sky and the jagged silhouette of the mountains that held it in a protective embrace. Life moved with the rhythm of the seasons, predictable and reassuring. In this quiet corner of the world, Claire Jensen was planning her future. At 24, she possessed a gentle confidence that seemed to draw people toward her. She was a second-grade teacher, beloved by her students for her patience and the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Her life was a map of happy certainties, and the final, most beautiful destination was just 2 weeks away. Her wedding to Mark Coulson, the boy she had loved since they were 16. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Claire's world was one of meticulous organization and heartfelt details. Her small apartment was filled with lists and binders, color-coded tabs marking the progress of her wedding plans. She had chosen the wildflowers herself, specified the pale blue of the bridesmaid dresses, and handwritten every invitation in elegant cursive. She moved through these final days with a sense of joyful purpose, a bride-to-be humming with the electricity of a life about to begin. Her mother, Eleanor, watched her with a mixture of pride and nostalgia, seeing in her daughter the best parts of herself, refined and made new. Claire was not just getting married. She was fulfilling a promise the town had made to all its children, that a good, simple life was not only possible, but deserved. The town of Cedar Creek was built on such promises. It was a community woven together by shared histories where family names echoed through generations. People knew their neighbors not just by name, but by their habits, the cars they drove, the dogs they walked. Doors were often left unlocked, and keys were left in ignitions. The prevailing belief was that the real dangers of the world existed somewhere else, in sprawling cities shown on the nightly news, far from the quiet streets and rustling cottonwood trees of their valley. This sense of security was the town's most cherished asset, a silent creed passed from one resident to the next. It was an innocence that was about to be irrevocably broken. On the afternoon of October 12th, Claire left her school with a box of wedding favors in the passenger seat of her worn but reliable sedan. Her plan was simple: a stop at the seamstress to pick up her altered wedding gown, a quick visit to her mother's house, and then home to Mark. It was a day like any other, marked by the mundane errands that precede a great event. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys and the earthy smell of decaying leaves. The sun cast long shadows across the valley floor as it began its slow descent behind the western peaks. She made her first stop, collecting the heavy garment bag that held her dress. The seamstress remarked on how happy she looked, how her face was lit from within. Claire's last known conversation was a brief phone call to Eleanor. She said she was running a few minutes behind, but would be there soon. She was taking the Old Canyon Road, a scenic dirt track shortcut that shaved 10 minutes off the drive. Her voice was light, untroubled. She told her mother she loved her. Then the line went dead. Hours crept by. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the valley into a deep, star-filled darkness. Mark arrived at the Jensen home, expecting to find Claire there with her mother. The two of them waited, their casual conversation slowly giving way to a gnawing anxiety. They called her pager, then her new cell phone, a bulky device she often forgot to turn on. There was no answer. A knot of dread tightened in Mark's stomach. This was not like Claire. She was never late without calling. She was the most reliable person he knew. The initial calm of the household fractured into panic. Mark and Claire's father, Robert, got into their trucks to drive the route between the seamstress and the Jensen home. They checked the main highway first, then the winding canyon road. It was on that desolate stretch of dirt and gravel, miles from the nearest house, that they saw it. Claire's sedan was parked crookedly on the shoulder, bathed in the cold, stark light of their headlights. The driver's side door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. The engine was cold. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, undisturbed. Her keys were still in the ignition. And on the smooth, dark plastic of the dashboard, placed with an unnerving deliberateness, was her diamond engagement ring. It caught the light, a tiny, solitary star in the immense darkness. Of Claire there was no sign. She was gone. The arrival of the sheriff's department shattered the night's silence. Flashing red and blue lights pulsed against the canyon walls, painting the desolate scene in frantic strokes of color. Detective David Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of his 25 years in law enforcement, stepped out of his patrol car and felt the familiar, unwelcome chill of a case that was fundamentally wrong. He knew the Jensens. He had watched Claire grow up. This was not some anonymous report. This was personal. The scene was quiet, sterile. There were no skid marks, no broken glass, no visible signs of a struggle. The placement of the ring was the most confounding detail. It suggested a departure, a conscious choice to leave a life behind. But it was contradicted by everything else. Her wallet, with its cash and credit cards, was in her purse. Her car, her only means of transport, was abandoned. It was a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit, a narrative that made no sense. Miller's gut told him this was not a runaway bride. This was something far worse. His first and most difficult task was to interview Mark Coulson. He found the young man sitting on the tailgate of his truck, his head in his hands, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Miller's questions were gentle but direct. He asked about their relationship, about any recent arguments, any signs of cold feet. Mark looked up, his eyes hollow with pain. He told the detective their life was perfect. He recounted their last conversation, the simple plans they had made for dinner. His alibi was solid. He had been at his construction job until well after Claire had disappeared. But Miller knew that in cases like this, suspicion always fell first on the partner. Mark's grief was palpable, yet the shadow of doubt had already begun to form. Next were Eleanor and Robert Jensen. Miller found them inside their home, a place that had always been filled with warmth and laughter, now shrouded in a suffocating silence. Eleanor was numb, her mind refusing to process the reality of the situation. She recounted her last phone call with her daughter, her words mechanical. Robert stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, as if he could will his daughter to walk up the driveway. They could offer no enemies, no secrets, no explanation for why anyone would harm Claire. She was, they insisted, just a good girl living a good life. As dawn broke, news of Claire's disappearance spread through Cedar Creek with the speed of a brush fire. The community responded with a powerful, unified surge of support. By mid-morning, hundreds of volunteers had gathered at the fire station, ready for instructions. They were farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, and high school students, their faces etched with worry. They fanned out across the rugged landscape, a determined army of friends and neighbors. They walked shoulder to shoulder through fields of sagebrush, navigated treacherous ravines, and scanned the banks of the cold, clear river that snaked through the valley. Among the searchers was George Peterson, the Jensens' longtime neighbor. He was a handyman, a fixture in the community known for his reliability and quiet competence. He was in his late 40s, a stocky man with a gentle demeanor who had known Claire since she was a little girl. He approached Detective Miller, his expression one of profound concern, and offered his help. He knew the backcountry better than anyone, he said. He could guide the search parties through the old logging roads and hidden canyons. He spoke to Robert and Eleanor, his voice thick with sympathy, assuring them that everyone was doing everything they could to bring their daughter home. The initial investigation churned forward, driven by a desperate sense of urgency. Detectives pursued two divergent paths. The first was the theory of a voluntary departure. They analyzed Claire's bank accounts, but there were no unusual withdrawals. Her credit cards remained untouched. They spoke to her closest friends, who dismissed the idea of her running away as absurd. She was happier than they had ever seen her. The second path, the one Miller privately believed, was foul play. But the absence of evidence was maddening. There were no witnesses on the remote road, no foreign fingerprints in the car, no DNA. The focus inevitably circled back to Mark. He was subjected to hours of grueling interviews. He took a polygraph test and passed, but the whispers in the town persisted. People struggled to comprehend a motiveless act of violence from a stranger, so they searched for an explanation closer to home. The pressure on Mark was immense. He was a young man grieving the loss of his future, simultaneously forced to defend himself against unspoken accusations. The town that had raised him now looked at him with suspicion. The search for Claire Jensen had become a search for a monster, and some had already decided who it was. The days bled into a week, then two. The physical searches were scaled back, the landscape having yielded no clues. The case was going cold before it had ever truly been hot. Time began to stretch and warp, measured not in days or weeks, but in seasons of loss. The first autumn without Claire gave way to a harsh, silent winter. The snow fell, covering the valley in a pristine blanket of white, burying any hope that a clue might still be found before the spring thaw. The vibrant, colorful flyers bearing Claire's smiling face, tacked to telephone poles and store windows, began to fade and tear, their edges softened by rain and sun. Her disappearance became a piece of the town's folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to teenagers, a permanent scar on the community's psyche. The first anniversary of her vanishing was marked by a quiet vigil in the town square. Candles flickered in the dusk, small points of light against an overwhelming darkness. Eleanor Jensen stood before the crowd, her face a mask of grief, and spoke of her daughter's kindness and her unshakable belief that they would one day have answers. She refused to let Claire become a ghost story. For Eleanor, the search never ended. It simply changed form. It became an internal, relentless quest for a truth that remained just out of reach. As the years passed, the official investigation dwindled to a file in a cabinet. Detective Miller retired, the unsolved Jensen case a heavy weight on his conscience. He had poured everything he had into it, chasing down every rumor, re-examining every piece of non-evidence, but it had led nowhere. He passed the thick, dusty binder to his successor, a young detective who saw it as a relic of a past failure, a case whose secrets were likely to remain buried forever. The file was a monument to uncertainty. Mark Coulson, unable to bear the constant reminders of his loss and the lingering suspicion in the eyes of his neighbors, eventually moved away. He left Cedar Creek to escape the ghost of the life he was supposed to have, seeking anonymity in a city where no one knew his name or his story. He never married. The love he had for Claire had been the defining feature of his youth, and its violent end had reshaped the rest of his life. The Jensen family existed in a state of suspended animation, a painful limbo between hope and despair. Robert retreated into his work, his grief a quiet, stoic burden, but Eleanor became a guardian of her daughter's memory. She kept Claire's bedroom exactly as she had left it, a perfect, untouched museum of a life interrupted. She called the sheriff's department on the 12th of every month, her voice steady as she asked the same question. "Anything new on my daughter's case?" The answer was always a gentle, apologetic no. Through it all, George Peterson remained a constant, comforting presence. He lived just across the street, a familiar and dependable neighbor. He continued to mow the Jensen's lawn in the summer and shovel their driveway in the winter. He would often stop by with a basket of vegetables from his garden or a freshly baked pie. He would sit with Eleanor on her porch, shaking his head and saying what a tragedy it was. What had happened to that sweet girl? He attended every vigil, his head bowed in sorrow. He was a pillar of support, a kind man sharing in their unending grief. His sympathy was a balm, but it was also a lie of monstrous proportions. He was the author of their pain, and he watched them suffer year after year from the best seat in the house. 24 years passed. A new century had dawned, and the world had changed in countless ways. Technology that had been the stuff of science fiction in 1999 was now commonplace. In Cedar Creek, a new generation had grown up with the story of Claire Jensen as a local legend. The cold case file, now yellowed with age, was transferred to the desk of Detective Isabella Rossi. She was young, sharp, and part of a new breed of investigators who believed that time and technology could solve even the most impossible cases. Rossi was not from Cedar Creek. She had no personal connection to the case, which allowed her to view it with fresh, dispassionate eyes. She started from the beginning, spending weeks reading every page of the file, every witness statement, every dead-end report. She was struck by the overwhelming focus on the fiancé and the runaway bride theory in the early days. It seemed to her that other possibilities had been too quickly dismissed. Her attention was drawn to a small, almost insignificant detail in the original property list from Claire's abandoned car. It noted all the items found, but Rossi was more interested in what was missing. Claire's friends and family had all mentioned a silver locket she always wore. It had been a gift from her grandmother, a small heart-shaped piece of jewelry she was never seen without. It was not in her purse and it was not in the car. It had simply vanished along with her. To Rossi, it was a loose thread, a tiny anomaly in a case full of them. At the same time, the state was implementing a new initiative, creating a comprehensive database that digitized and cross-referenced old pawnshop records with law enforcement files. It was a long, tedious process, but it was already yielding results in other cold cases. Rossi submitted a request to have all pawnshop transactions from the region from late 1999 and 2000 scanned for any mention of a silver heart-shaped locket. Weeks later, she got a hit. It was a faint digital ghost, an entry from a pawnshop in a neighboring county dated November of 2000, just over a year after Claire's disappearance. The record showed that a man had sold a silver locket matching the description for $20. The shop owner, now deceased, had been required by law to hold items for a period before melting them down. He had followed the rules, and for reasons no one could recall, the police had collected the locket as part of a routine seizure of unclaimed goods. A note in the old file confirmed this. A detective had looked into it, but without any forensic way to connect it to Claire, the lead was dropped. The locket had been logged into an evidence locker and forgotten. Rossi felt a surge of adrenaline. She filed a request to retrieve the locket from the cavernous central evidence warehouse. After a week of searching through dusty boxes, a technician found it. It was small and tarnished, sealed in a small plastic bag with a faded handwritten tag. Rossi sent it directly to the state crime lab, hoping that after more than 2 decades, modern science could find what the naked eye could not. The lab technicians handled the locket with surgical precision. They carefully swabbed the exterior and, using a fine tool, opened the delicate clasp. Inside, nestled deep within the mechanism, they found what they were looking for, a minuscule flake of dried, dark material. It was blood. They also found faint traces of skin cells on the chain. They extracted DNA from both samples. The results came back a week later. The DNA from the skin cells was a match to Claire Jensen, whose profile had been created years ago from a hairbrush her mother had preserved. The locket was hers. The second profile from the blood inside the clasp belonged to an unknown male. The blood was not Claire's. It belonged to her killer. He had cut himself while tearing it from her neck. They ran the male profile through CODIS, the national database of convicted offenders, but there was no match. The killer had no significant criminal record. For a moment it seemed they had hit another dead end. But Rossi was not deterred. She took the next step, one that was unavailable to the original investigators: forensic genealogy. She submitted the unknown profile to a specialized lab that could build a family tree by cross-referencing the DNA with public genealogy databases. The genealogist worked for weeks, patiently assembling a complex web of distant cousins and forgotten ancestors. Finally, the search narrowed. The DNA belonged to a family with deep roots in Cedar Creek. The genetic markers pointed to one of two brothers. One had moved to another state in the 1980s and had never returned. The other was George Peterson, the kind, helpful handyman who still lived across the street from Eleanor Jensen. Detective Rossi stared at the name on the report, a cold feeling spreading through her chest. It couldn't be. The man who had been a comforting presence for the grieving family, the man who had helped search for Claire, the man everyone trusted. She reviewed the old files again. George had been interviewed briefly in 1999, as had all the neighbors. He had provided a simple alibi. He was home alone, watching television. No one had ever thought to question it. He was invisible precisely because he was so familiar. Rossi knew she needed one final piece of evidence to make an arrest: a direct DNA sample from George to match the blood on the locket. A covert surveillance operation was authorized. 2 plainclothes officers were assigned to watch George Peterson, now a stooped man of 71, living a quiet life of retirement. They followed him on his morning walk to the grocery store, to the post office. After 2 days, they got their chance. George bought a coffee at a local cafe and, after finishing it, tossed the disposable cup into a public trash can on the street. An officer retrieved it moments later. The cup was sent to the lab. The results were back in 24 hours. The DNA from the saliva on the rim was a perfect match to the blood from the locket. They had him. The ghost who had haunted Cedar Creek for 24 years finally had a name and a face. Detective Rossi and her partner drove to George Peterson's small, tidy house. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind of day that felt impossibly bright for the dark task ahead. George answered the door with a gentle smile, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He recognized Rossi from around town and invited the officers inside, offering them a glass of iced tea. His home was immaculate, filled with photographs of his late wife and his grandchildren. It was the home of a beloved patriarch, not a predator. They sat in his living room on a floral sofa covered in plastic. Rossi began calmly, asking him about the old days, about the Jensens, about Claire. George spoke of her fondly, a sad, wistful look on his face. He said he still thought of her often. Then Rossi placed a photograph of the silver locket on the coffee table. "Do you recognize this, George?" she asked, her voice even. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He shook his head slowly, but his eyes were fixed on the picture. Rossi laid out the evidence, piece by methodical piece: the pawn shop, the DNA, the blood, the coffee cup. She spoke in a low, steady tone, her words filling the quiet room. As she finished, the grandfatherly facade that George Peterson had maintained for decades finally crumbled. The kindly smile vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed emptiness. The color drained from his face. He stared at his hands, then back at Rossi, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he began to talk. The confession spilled out of him, a torrent of secrets held for nearly a quarter of a century. He told them he had always harbored a secret, obsessive affection for Claire. He had watched her grow from a child into a woman, and in his twisted mind, his neighborly fondness had curdled into a possessive fantasy. He saw her as his, a perfect creation he deserved to be near. The news of her impending marriage, her plan to move away with Mark, had been unbearable to him. It was a betrayal of the life he had imagined for them. On that October afternoon, he had been driving home when he saw her car pulled over on the deserted canyon road. He said she had stopped to admire the view. He stopped his truck behind her under the pretense of checking on her. He told her one of her tires looked low and offered to drive her home while he sent a friend to fix it. She trusted him. He was George, the friendly neighbor. She got into his truck without a second thought. He did not drive her home. He drove her miles into the mountains to a remote, dilapidated cabin his family had owned for generations. There, he tried to convince her to call off the wedding, to stay in Cedar Creek, to be with him. She was horrified, confused, then terrified. She tried to run. He grabbed her, and in the struggle, she fought back, her fingernails scratching his hand, drawing blood. The locket she wore caught on his finger, and he ripped it from her neck. Panicked and enraged by her rejection, he silenced her. He had not planned to kill her, he claimed, but his obsession had tipped into violence, and there was no going back. He buried her body in a shallow grave in the dense woods behind the cabin. He drove back to her car, and in a moment of cold calculation, took off her engagement ring and placed it on the dashboard. He wanted to create confusion, to plant the seed of the runaway bride story. He knew it would send the police looking in the wrong direction, likely toward her fiancé. A year later, desperate for cash and arrogant in his belief that he had committed the perfect crime, he pawned the locket, the one mistake that would eventually undo him. After the confession, George Peterson, frail and defeated, led the investigators to the cabin. The structure was collapsing, reclaimed by nature, but he walked directly to a spot beneath a tall pine tree. An excavation team began to dig. A few feet down, they found what was left of Claire Jensen. The search that had begun in the autumn of 1999 was finally over. The arrest of George Peterson sent a seismic shock through Cedar Creek. The news was met with stunned disbelief, which quickly morphed into a collective sense of horror and betrayal. The man who had offered condolences, who had shared in their grief, was the monster they had been looking for all along. He had hidden in plain sight, his kindness a mask for an unspeakable evil. The quiet whispers that had followed Mark Coulson for years were finally silenced, replaced by a profound and heavy guilt. Detective Rossi's hardest duty was her last one in the case. She drove to Eleanor Jensen's home, the same home where so much grief had been contained for so long. She sat with the elderly woman, now in her late 70s, and gently told her everything. She told her that they had found Claire and that she could finally be brought home. And she told her who was responsible. Eleanor listened in silence, her hands trembling in her lap. The news was both a devastating blow and a long-awaited release. The uncertainty was over, but the truth was a horror beyond anything she could have imagined. The man who had fixed her faucet and shoveled her snow had taken her daughter's life. Given the irrefutable DNA evidence and his detailed confession, George Peterson pleaded guilty to murder to avoid a trial. The plea spared the Jensen family the agony of reliving their trauma in a courtroom. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At his sentencing, he offered no apology, no explanation beyond the rambling confession he had given to police. He was a hollowed-out old man, the darkness within him finally exposed to the light. The community of Cedar Creek began the slow, difficult process of healing. A funeral was finally held for Claire Jensen. Mark Coulson returned for the service, his hair now gray. the lines on his face telling the story of a life lived in the shadow of a great loss. The town that had once suspected him now embraced him, offering apologies that felt tragically inadequate. Claire was laid to rest in the local cemetery, under a simple headstone that read, "Beloved daughter, home at last." George Peterson was sent to the state penitentiary, where he would live out the remainder of his days in anonymity. He was no longer the friendly handyman, but a number in a system, his name a permanent stain on the history of the town he had deceived. His life became a quiet, lonely postscript to the vibrant one he had stolen. In the years that followed, the Jensen family found a way to transform their pain into purpose. They started the Claire Jensen Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to funding cold case units and providing support to families of missing persons. Eleanor, once a quiet homemaker, became a fierce advocate, her voice carrying the weight of her experience. She ensured that her daughter's legacy would not be defined by her death, but by the help and hope offered to others who were still waiting in the dark. The story of Claire Jensen became a testament to the enduring power of a mother's love and the relentless pursuit of justice. It served as a stark reminder that evil can wear the most familiar of faces and that the deepest secrets can lie buried just across the street. The truth had not come from a sudden revelation or a deathbed confession, but from a tiny drop of blood, a forgotten piece of jewelry, and the patient work of a detective who believed that no victim should ever be forgotten. Justice had finally arrived in Cedar Creek, quiet and methodical, carried on the cutting edge of science and the unyielding strength of human resolve. Claire was home, and the love that kept her memory alive had, in the end, been stronger than the darkness that took her away.